In his article, CPK Indispensable Index or Misleading Measure, Steve Daum quotes Mark Twain as saying, "Facts are stubborn things, but statistics are pliable." Wasn't Twain also the one who said lies, damn lies, and statistics?
Yeah, he wasn't a big fan of stats. He wasn't a big fan of statistics.
Strangely, just an aside, Barb Cleary, also from PQ Systems, had a great article she wrote about the poor maligned statistician, about going to a party and you don't want to admit you're a statistician, but it's a whole other story.
Yeah.
As many statisticians have pointed out, including Don Wheeler, CPK, the process capability statistic, can be easily manipulated. It's often used incorrectly without enough knowledge of what is needed to use it correctly. And as Don points out in his article, whether you are the producer or the consumer, if you are using capability analysis for decision making in your organization, you must fully understand its use and how to use it. So with us today to shed some light on CPK is Steve Daum, Director of Development for PQ Systems. Hi, Steve. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, Mike. Hello, Dirk. Thanks for having me on today.
Sure. So for those who aren't already familiar with industrial statistic, what is CPK and how is it used in general?
Okay. Well, CPK is just a statistic, and it's one of several statistics that are used when you're doing a capability analysis. And one of the most important ways that it's used is for communications within the supply chain. You mentioned producers and consumers. If you're making a product for someone, supplying it to them, you'll want to communicate with them about quality levels in a sort of consistent, agreed upon way. And CPK is one statistic that's used in this way. We talk to a lot of people who get into discussions either with their customers or their suppliers up and down the supply chain. And the question is, what is CPK? What does it mean? And how do we interpret it? How do we interpret this? So the best way for me to describe what it does is it answers this question for you, and that is, how capable is my product or my process of meeting the customer needs? And the customer needs in this case are described or represented by specifications, which are also called tolerances. So, you're familiar with an example like brake pads. They may need to be 10 millimeters thick, and maybe the customer is willing to accept them up to 11. So in that case, the target is 10, and the upper spec or the upper specification is 11. So using those two numbers and then using measurements taken from your brake pads, you can calculate CPK. And it's a very easy thing to calculate, but it's also a sophisticated representation of the answer to that question, which is, how capable is my process of meeting the customer needs? So typically you'll get an answer when you make this calculation, maybe between 0 and 3. Now the number can be negative, and that's a bad thing. It can be higher than 3. Many of your customers may have a requirement for what your CPK should be. Maybe they say it should be at least 1.33. The important thing to know about CPK is that the higher it is, the less likely you are to deliver into the supply chain product that doesn't meet the requirements. So that's basically what it is and what it's used for.
Good. All right. So now that we understand a little bit about what CPK is, so maybe you can help us understand what it isn't. I mean, how is it misused, or maybe how is it misunderstood and then misused?
That's a good question. If you think about going to your doctor, one of the first things they do is take your blood pressure, and that's an important piece of data about your overall health. But when your doctor probes further into why you're there to visit, there will be many other factors that come into play. And they won't focus solely on the blood pressure reading. Now, maybe if it's really out of whack, that'll be their main concern, but they'll have a lot of other questions. CPK is similar to this. It's important and it's useful, especially as a communication tool to communicate quality levels, but it's not the only thing people should be thinking about. It does tell you how well you're able to produce within the tolerances, but it also comes with some assumptions about how it's calculated, some assumptions about the data, and some things that need to be in place beyond just capability for it to be a valid representation of your process. One misuse of this is that people will focus solely on this one number, and they won't look at their system with an overall statistical mindset, an SPC way of thinking about how they manage, their product and their processes.
So I mean, in your article, and maybe you've kind of already touched on this, but you mentioned in the title, it's Indispensable Index or Misleading Measure. So what you just described, is that how people are misled? They see this, oh, I've got a CPK of 1.3, therefore everything is fine. But isn't that the case? I mean, how is that misleading? I guess I just don't understand why, if they have that number, they might be misled. If you can maybe just describe that a little bit further.
Okay. First of all, a customer, someone buying your brake pads from you, for example, they'll want your CPK to be higher. Now, once you know how to calculate CPK, and it's not difficult, and once you look at the formulas, you'll understand that there's only a few things you can do to make your CPK higher. And some of them don't have anything to do with making your product better. One example is that if you sample more frequently, say every 1 minute rather than every 15 minutes, you may see your CPK value start to increase. Now, you haven't changed your process or your product at all, but you're reporting a slightly higher CPK because the variation from samples taken close together, will cause the CPK to grow a little bit. It can cause the CPK to grow. So that's one possibility. We talk to a lot of people, and they work hard to improve quality, but their customers, have a certain amount of pressure on them to produce analytical results, within their specifications. And so it's not always true that education about CPK, and more importantly, the broader statistical approach to improving quality, those aren't always the top priority in a manufacturing organization. And so, we talk to a lot of people. They're under pressure to have higher CPKs, and they often ask questions about, how do I make my CPK higher? So overall, people have good intent, they do good work, but there are ways to manipulate the statistic. And like I mentioned in the previous question, it can't be your only focus. You have to understand that if you do a capability analysis for some process that's wildly out of control, you'll get an answer back. And today it might be a good answer, but tomorrow, because your process is not predictable, it could be a bad answer. So you just have to be careful. You have to be more holistic in how you deal with CPK.
Well, that's a nice lead in, actually, in the couple of minutes we got left. It's a nice lead in to something that you mentioned in your article. You have something which you called the 6-way analysis, and I believe we have a slide of that here that we can put up. If you can just tell us a bit what the 6-way analysis is and how that maybe ties into the more holistic approach that you just mentioned.
Okay, great. Yeah, the 6-way analysis is a more overall view of things, and one of the things you'll see on this page is that it does have a CPK number on it. Now, because of the screen I'm looking at, I can't read it right now, but that's just one value in the lower right-hand corner of the chart. If you look in the upper left, you'll see an individual's chart. That's a control chart, and so it gives you some idea of how the process is behaving and where it is centered. And if you see the red squares on there, that's an indication that there's some variation there that maybe could be explained and possibly acted upon. So that's what's in the upper left is the individual's control chart. Below that is moving range, where you look at not just where the process is centered, but how much it varies over time. Because again, you want to be holistic. Where is it centered? What's the variation? That's the first two charts. Then in the bottom left is a run chart, and again, it's just a time series view of the data. It gives you some context about what has happened recently, rather than just looking at one point in time. On the right side of the chart at the top, you see the histogram, which gives you an idea of the shape of the distribution. Once you get into capability analysis, there are some assumptions made about that shape of that distribution, so it's good to be able to visualize that. In the middle, we have a normal probability plot, and that gives you an idea of how close to the normal distribution this set of data is falling. And then in the bottom right is a summary analysis that kind of gives you a visual of the allowable spread that the customer has defined. That's their upper and lower tolerance. What is your process producing most of the time? And so this is a good way to visualize that. And like I said earlier, CPK is just one value that's shown on this screen, but if you can learn to take in this six-way analysis and look at each piece, you'll get a lot more value and meaning about what's going on out of it.
So not just trusting in one number, but being familiar with all the various tools that are available to you, and to be looking at all of those to get like you said, a more holistic view of what's going on with your process. Well, if you're interested in more about CPK and so forth, be sure to join us for the live webinar that Steve is presenting next Thursday. CPK, Indispensable Index or Misleading Measure. That's going to be next Thursday, December 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Be sure to sign up for that. There's a link down underneath the player page down there. You can click, go out and sign up for it. Steve, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, and we'll see you on Thursday.
Okay.
All right, terrific. Thanks a lot.